Hi, welcome back to Cosmic and Body Horror. If you enjoy my content, please consider hitting the like button. It's the only way the YouTube algorithm notices me. Formless protoplasm able to mock and reflect all forms and organs and processes, viscous agglutinations of bubbling cells, rubbery 15-foot spheroids infinitely plastic and ductile, slaves of suggestion, builders of cities, more and more sullen, more and more intelligent, more and more amphibious, more and more imitative. Great God, what madness made even those blasphemous old ones willing to use and carve such things? H.P. Lovecraft, At the Mountains of Madness. A Shoggoth is a sentient blob of self-shaping gelatinous flesh, something like a giant amoeba. It is some 15 feet in diameter if it shaped itself into a sphere, but larger and smaller versions exist. A Shoggoth is capable of shaping itself into whatever organs or shapes it finds necessary at the moment. However, in its usual state it tends to sport a roiling profusion of eyes, mouths and pseudopodia. The Shoggoth can kill its enemies by enveloping them and generating enough suction force to decapitate their victims. That is specifically how they fought the Elder Things during their rebellion. They first appeared in H.P. Lovecraft, At the Mountains of Madness. Spawn of the Sea by Donald Wandrei. Weird Tales, May, 1933. The original illustration of this story was captioned with, "He took careful aim, steadied himself and fired true." And this was its teaser, an amazing story of a weird voyage with a frightful sea beast spawned out of slime and darkness as cargo. Tom Gordon had never paid any undue attention to the bottle until the moment he stumbled and knocked it from its shelf to shatter upon the floor. From that instant, his interest became prodigious. Tom had been making a comfortable income from his gift shop for several years. He made a specialty of odd things, oriental jewelry, antique terracotta figurines, illuminated parchment leaves, African sculptures, old Java batiks, and 1,000 other items that were both unusual and artistic. Every summer, during the slack season, he went abroad for a month or so and wandered from place to place, purchasing whatever odds and ends appealed to him. The bottle was one of the acquisitions of his most recent trip. It came to his attention when he was idling on the shore of Fez del Tuar one morning and saw an Arab urchin playing with it. Tom wanted the bottle because it was obviously the craftsmanship of a bygone century. It looked something like a decanter, something like a Greek amphora, and was perfectly blown, with a long, slender neck and a gracefully rounded base. At one time it must have been buried, for stains and iridescent colors made even more opaque its original coloring of brown. It was stoppered and sealed with wax that had partly weathered away but still seemed almost as hard as stone. Tom bargained with the shrewd gamin and finally obtained the bottle for the equivalent of 15 cents. His Arabic was as poor as the lad's French, so the two had difficulty understanding each other. All that Tom discovered about the history of the curious bottle was that the urchin had recently found it half buried in the sand. The bottle made its way back to America with the rest of Tom's purchases and, in due time, was placed upon a shelf. No one priced it during the months it stood there, but Tom didn't mind, since he had bought it primarily to add a touch of atmosphere to his shop. On the shelf, it remained half forgotten until the accident that destroyed it. Tom had little opportunity to regret his loss. His annoyance vanished when he saw the yellowed paper lying among bits of broken glass. Despite its apparent age, the paper was still strong and covered with quaint, fine script, though the writing on the outer leaf had faded for the most part to illegibility. He took the tightly rolled manuscript home with him that night with as considerable interest as he had ever had in any of his purchases. The dawn of another day was breaking before he had fully deciphered it and transcribed it into modern English. Most of the first page was hopelessly dimmed. He could make nothing of the superscription, and even the date was ambiguous. He deciphered a 17, but whether the year intended was 17 or 17, it was impossible to decide. Tantalized by the unreadable introduction, he eventually proceeded with the body of a manuscript that was, in many ways, even more tantalizing. The hours flew by with never a thought from him as he pored over the script. To be sure, he grasped an occasional word on the outer leaf whose writing had been largely effaced by the action of sunlight. But nothing like a continuous narrative became possible until he turned to the second page, which began in the middle of a sentence. Day out the storm broke. We passengers were all ordered below deck, while the crew raced above, hauling in sail and trying to save the ship. May God's grace protect the 7 seas from another such gale. Out of a sooty sky, the rain lashed in torrents, the wind screamed through the rigging, and the vastest waves that ever were boiled up around us. The ship lurched and tipped as though any minute it would turn over or sink, and not one of us was unbruised after an hour of wild pitching to and fro. The women, poor things, were all the more terrified, for it was dangerous to risk lighting the lamps. We huddled in the dark and could hardly hear the shouting of the crew above the terrible uproar, with the waves pounding, thunder crashing, and the wind howling in a kind of fury. But besides these, we heard ominous cracks and heavy objects smashing across the decks, yet we knew not what went on up there. There was little food to be found, and that little, of course, went to the women and children. The rest of us did what we could to tie them and ourselves to anything solid or brace ourselves against sudden lurches. We got no sleep, neither did we talk, such was the fear upon us. Many hours passed with the ship staggering and being battered, yet I knew not at what time God's wrath descended. There was a long, sickening slide of the ship, a groaning and bursting of timbers, and then a sudden deafening crash. We heard running feet, and next the panic caught us, poor devils, for the hatches were unbattened, and a voice roared down that the ship was sinking. All was noise and confusion, the air a sound and frenzy, everyone bawling and struggling and fighting to get out, only a few of us remembering that we were gentlemen. Such was the terror. Up on deck, we found the wildest disorder. 2 of the masts down, the other sail blown to tatters, and one of the boats squarely smashed. The crew were desperately trying to launch the seaworthy boats, but another was wrecked before it got clear. By the glare of lightning we saw the awful scene. The captain, God have mercy on his soul, stood by his post. He ordered the passengers off first. Gun in either hand, he shot down the cowards who tried to save themselves by leaving the women behind. I hastened toward the boat nearest me. That is the last I remembered, save for hearing a sharp crack and receiving from behind a blow on my head. Pain numbed my limbs as total blackness blotted out the scene. For a very long time I must have lost my senses. I awakened with a throbbing headache and a thirst. I opened my eyes to the glare of the sun. The sea was like a sapphire, smooth and motionless, and bright as far as I could see, with no land anywhere. When I attempted to rise, my head throbbed so fiercely that I fell back. I felt it and discovered a swelling, with dried blood already caked into a scab, by which I judged that I must have lain unconscious for at least 2 days. I was weak. The pangs of hunger assailed me, and an intolerable thirst parched my mouth. With difficulty I finally dragged myself to a clogged scupper that retained some warm, dirty rainwater, and drank it in gulps. Feeling considerably refreshed, I rested until my headache had subsided, then cautiously arose. I was still weak, but I needed to know the best, or the worst, about my predicament. The deck was swept clean of every movable object, and the framework itself wrecked in places. Besides listing, the ship hung low. I surmised that it had sprung a leak or shipped a quantity of water. Not another soul appeared to be aboard. I made my way to a hatch and descended into gloom. The matches in my pocket were useless from having been soaked in the storm. I am no sailor and knew little about the nature of ships, but I was acquainted with the general plan of this one and sloshed through a couple of inches of water to the galley. Long fumbling around in darkness was finally rewarded by the discovery of dry matches, one of which I promptly used to light a lamp. I satisfied my hunger with the first leftovers that came to hand. Stale bread, a piece of salt cod, and some raw potatoes, washed down with a draught of English whiskey that refreshed me greatly. I then set out to examine the ship. In the passengers' quarters I found 3 corpses, which I heaved overboard after brief prayers for the repose of their souls. I found 2 more bodies in the crew's quarters, and I discovered 1 living man. He must have been among those shot by the captain for disobeying the command to let the women and children escape first, and had crawled below later, for I came upon him hanging from a berth. At any rate, a ball had pierced his thigh and gone clean through. He suffered much from loss of blood, had a fever, and was delirious when I discovered him. But if gangrene did not set in, he had a fair chance to recover. I did what I could for him, glad of any companionship, even though it might not be of the best, and devoutly prayed that he would live. Whether the other passengers and the crew had taken to the boats or been claimed by the sea, I do not know. There was no one else aboard, and I can scarcely believe that anything human could have survived so terrific a storm. I next went over the remainder of the ship. The hold had filled with an amount of water that I considered dangerous, and I wondered how much longer the ship would last. I could not determine if it had sprung a leak and was still settling toward its grave, or if it had shipped an extraordinary amount of water in the gale. The hold was an evil-smelling place where the cargo had shifted and some boxes broken open, the others likewise being or becoming waterlogged. I do not know what the cargo was, but from as much as I could see of the shattered boxes, it appeared to consist equally of a greenish powder which I judged to be some chemical. A whitish salt that I also could not identify, a gummy, malodorous substance, and boxes simply marked seeds, none of these latter being broken. My search then took me to the captain's quarters, which were a bitter disappointment. I hunted everywhere, but the ship's log was gone, including the sailing chart. There were other maps and papers, but not a scrap that would indicate our position, even as it was at the height of the storm. Most of the instruments were hopelessly damaged and useless except to someone who might know how to repair them. In the galley I found a great many barrels of salt pork, salt cod, flour, potatoes, various condiments, 5 tubs of pickles, much liquor, and varying amounts of corn, nuts, rice, coconuts, venison, and so on, together with about 24 live geese, chickens, and turkeys. Altogether there were ample provisions, upon which 2 men could subsist for many months, possibly a year even. The supply of fresh water was low, but I collected about 2 barrels more in different parts of the ship, which retained rainwater from the recent blow. At intervals, I ministered to the sick man. Toward evening he began to improve. A couple of days later, the fever left him and he thereafter grew rapidly better. I cannot convey the loneliness of the next month, and it would be idle to make the attempt. Bill, his full name was William Geraghty, and I wore out our eyes peering vainly for sails that never came, and land that we could not find. We had no conception of where we were, since the ship might have been blown hundreds of miles off her course during the gale. According to the last reckoning he had heard, we were approximately 900 miles from the nearest known land. 900? It might as well have been 9,000. Yet we continued to hope, even though we knew we were far off the trade route which, God knows, was travelled by no more than 3 or 4 ships a year, in this sea remote from the Americas, and farther still from England. We spent weary days building a crude boat, caulked it with tar, rigged out a clumsy sail, and tested it. I doubt whether a craft was ever more unseaworthy. We hadn't the heart to go to certain death in it, for it wouldn't steer true, it pitched crazily, and we couldn't put into it a fraction of the water and provisions that we would need. We learned much by this experience, but we were also discouraged. Nevertheless, disheartened by the alternatives of eventual starvation on our prison or certain death by sea, we set to work slowly erecting a more substantial boat. So the days went by, and the sun shone in deep blue skies, and the water lapped softly against the sides, and at night the stars came out brilliantly except when the moon rode high. Yet never a sail hove in sight, and though we probably drifted with currents, there was nothing to tell us how rapidly, and we saw no land. By ourselves, we could not repair and raise and rig a mast large enough to do us any good, for the season of calms had come. And since what canvas we had was too small for any benefit short of a stiff blow, we saved it for our boat. There was furthermore around the ship a bad smell that got on our nerves. It became stronger as the days passed until we determined to investigate its source. We traced it to the hold. We tried bailing the water out, but the stench was so sickening that we were compelled to cease. The water in the hold was queer stuff, unusually warm, thick and slimy, and a pale green in color. The cargo had evidently gone bad, or the chemicals, if that's what they were, caused the smell. We decided that the odor would dissipate in time, but it was so bad below that we took to sleeping on deck and going down only for our meals. There were strange noises that also bothered us, not the usual creakings and strainings of an old ship, but something we couldn't quite place. We used to hear it, as though down in the hold or far away, a stirring as of someone awakening, and a simmer like water coming to a boil. The smell didn't vanish. It got worse until, even though it wasn't so bad in the daytime on deck, at night, when we slept, it seeped up and polluted the air. We tried closing the hatches, but it did no good. Then it got into the food, and we not only had to smell the stench, but taste it. I don't know when the combination of curious sounds and horrible odors became too much for our nerves. I think it was the 43rd day of our drifting, but it doesn't matter. All the preceding night, the stink had hung heavily like a smoke cloud, and the strange noise, almost like that of a heart, became a rhythmic pulse as the night wore on. I at first believed my nerves were beginning to give way, but since Bill had had the same impressions, I thought we couldn't both be wrong. Somehow, I felt uneasy. The monotony and solitude were bad enough. Now we had a rotten miasma, and a singular noise to contend with besides. That morning we decided to make another investigation of the hold. Since we knew that the smell came from there, we suspected that the noises might have some connection with it. Perhaps a fermentation was going on. If worst came to worst, we might as well devote our time to carrying the bilge out or heaving the boxes and cargo overboard. I myself was rather sure that they were responsible for both the bad smell and the queer sounds. Going below was like walking into salt water. The odor was that strong, pushing and holding us back, a nauseating odor, filthy, abominable and beast-like. I think I was faint when we reached the hold, for I cannot otherwise quite account for what happened. Bill was carrying a lighted candle while I unbattened the hatch and looked in. "Shut it! Shut it!" Bill screamed, and we hurled ourselves against the door, fastening it securely. Down in the hold we had seen a vast, shapeless mass of undulating greenish-white stuff, thick as skin, with a beating motion like a pulse. The revolting odor came from that mass, but what terrified us most was the way that pulpy substance leaped up at us when we opened the hatch. Leaped, like an unknown animal after prey, with the furious beating of the pulse, its surface writhing into tentacles that flung at us, and a hiss like an inarticulate cry. The candle went out when Bill jumped. Darkness dropped upon us like a shroud. We heard the thing undulating in the hold and pounding against the hatch. Would the barrier hold, or was the noise only that odd pulse beating, or the hammering of our own hearts? Panic caught us. We dashed for the other hatchways and fought to get out. Once on deck, we felt a bit ashamed, with the morning sun shining hotly. We looked at each other, white and shaken for all that. Then a wave of corruption eddied around us, and we knew it came from the thing in the hold. Tacitly, we avoided reference to the incident and made no further attempt to investigate. Who can say what we saw, or whether we really saw it? Yet I was convinced that a sea change had somehow come over the cargo, that a slow, abnormal and utterly loathsome transformation was taking place. How else to account for it? The salt seawater and the hot sun must have combined with the seeds and chemicals to germinate a hideous, perhaps unknown, form of life down in the hold. Life? Not as I knew it, but something that was strangely and dreadfully alive. All that day we toiled, bringing food from the galley and stowing it on deck near the stump of the foremast. Every descent was a trip of unexpressed fear, for we could hear a distant heaving in the hold. But by nightfall, we had carried everything that we would need above. Nothing could have persuaded us to leave the deck again. We battened the hatches and caulked all places where the storm had smashed openings in the deck. It must have been long after sunset before our labors were ended. It is not strange, therefore, that when we retired, I quickly fell asleep, worn out from my exertions, despite the tension of peril that hung around, the persistent throb which crept up from below, and the mouldy reek that poisoned every breath I drew. I woke with a start, to hear a pulsing throb that made the whole ship quiver. But what brought me leaping to my feet in rage was the sight of Bill stealthily lowering himself over the side. The coward had filled our first crude boat with provisions and water. He was trying to steal away with our only means of escape, leaving me, who had saved his life, behind to face death and terror alone. I might have killed him, but I didn't. He was unprotected because he was lowering himself with both hands. I whipped out my pistol and had him covered before he could scramble back. He didn't risk dropping to the sea. He knew that I could and would have shot him before he could pull out of range. I made him haul back every scrap of food and hoist the boat after I had disarmed him. Then I tied him securely and went back to sleep. I knew he would be dangerous from now on, but I also knew he would be unnerved by that hellish pulse which sounded from the ship's hold, the commotion the shapeless thing made, and the stench that hung thicker than ever. Existence became a nightmare. I had long abandoned hope of rescue. The only recourse left was to finish the larger boat on which we were laboring and trust that we made land. The stench on deck was horrible, and at night I heard that damnable pounding that became steadily more insistent. What if the thing broke out? I trembled at the thought of the consequences. And now I had to watch Bill every second. His aid was essential to finishing the boat, but the rat would kill me and flee the minute he received the opportunity. Each long second I was under the greatest strain, listening to that maddening beat, watching the moves that Bill made, and always faint with the putrescence that assailed my nostrils. Yet I toiled as strenuously as Bill to finish our boat, and as if all this was not disaster enough, the food began to spoil under the hot rays of the sun. The pork and cod became wormy. The venison dried out until it was tough as leather. Hardtack, pickles, potatoes, and nuts were about all we had left, except the flour that we occasionally made into soggy bread over a carefully guarded fire and munched without appetite. At night, I trussed Bill up and obtained what fitful sleep I could. In the morning, I released him and kept a hawk-like watch over his movements while we sweated over the boat. He didn't say much. He was sullen, and by the wicked look in his eyes, I knew he was still planning to escape. All through the night, he would talk and mumble and try to keep me awake. "You can't do this," he would plead when the distant pounding became loud. "What if that beast gets out? You'd run away and I'd get killed. It ain't fair. Damn you, take these ropes off. I won't try to escape." On and on he would go until he fell asleep, or I did. To make sure that he wouldn't try deserting again, I insisted on dismantling our first boat so that we could use the planks on our second one and progress faster. It took the heart out of him when he saw his way of escape disappear under his eyes, but I imagined he would work more willingly thereafter on the other boat. I realize now what a foolish action that was, for I ought to have kept a means of escape in constant readiness. Bill suggested time after time that we draw lots to see who should win the first boat and take a chance on reaching land. I wouldn't listen to him. I felt in a way responsible for him, and I was determined that we would live or die together. Any one calamity would have been disheartening, and I had 3 battles to fight: the silent hostility of Bill, the eternal sea itself, and now this living creature that dwelt in the hold. Bill claimed that the thing was some sort of sea monster that had been washed aboard during the storm and had kept on growing. I said, and I still think, that it was a fearful product of heat, seeds, and chemical action occurring in saline water, but no matter how rational our explanations were, they didn't help us keep a grip on ourselves. I remembered all too vividly that gluey, greenish mass quivering foully with a subhuman, less and yet more than animal life, and the hideously purposeful fashion in which it contracted and leaped at us. We raced against time, trying to finish a seaworthy boat for our escape. It would have been an arduous task anywhere, even with adequate materials. Our nerves were ragged, our tools were inferior, and we had to employ any plank we could lay our hands on. It was a hopeless race from the beginning, and we knew it. But at any rate, it kept us from brooding over our plight, and a kind of madness drove us on, to the heat of a tropical sun and the interminable sound of a heart beating with monotonous regularity. For 3 days we lived in a wretched hell. By the 46th day, the faraway throb had swelled to a thud that was weirdly alive, louder than the faint lapping of waves or the blood that coursed in my temples. At night, it fairly drove us wild. We listened to it with a sort of dreadful fascination, hardly conscious that for hours our movements had been rhythmically actuated by its tempo. I didn't sleep well, and I didn't sleep long after we turned in that evening. I dozed a bit, only to wake from insane dreams to insane reality, and then doze again while that accursed heart beat steadily. I came to a sudden, terrified awakening when a heavy crash drowned out the sound. Bill screamed, and I leaped over to him, freeing his bonds at a slash. Together we crouched in the darkness, listening. A sucky gurgling came from down in the hold. We heard a commotion as of oil bubbling, and the stench settled around us worse than ever. And closer yet, louder still, came the pounding that was shattering our nerves. "My God! It's broken out!" whimpered Bill. "Oh, shut up!" I answered angrily. "Crying won't help. The thing's loose. Our only chance is to kill it or get away as fast as we can." "You can't kill a thing like that," he mumbled. I knew he was right. There were plenty of balls for the guns, but most of the powder was ruined in the storm. Besides, what effect could the pellets have on a creature of such huge size and unfamiliar nature? "Come on," I ordered. "We'll have to hurry." But we halted in dismay before our boat. At least a week would be needed to complete it, and we felt certain that we would not have anywhere near a week's time. The way that that monster moved around below us made us shiver. It must have flowed along, for it made a sticky noise, and every once in a while we heard a sort of plop as if it had swallowed something, or maybe felt around with some tentacle like an octopus's that gave out a sucking smack when it jerked away. And ever the pulse drummed louder, hellishly regular, shattering our nerves with each thud. "We'll have to dismantle the boat and make a raft," I curtly told Bill. He started to complain. "Then stay here and rot, unless the thing gets you first," I cursed. "We won't have much chance of coming out alive on a raft, but we won't have any chance if we remain here. And we'll have to work fast. It's only a question of hours before the thing breaks on deck." As if to confirm my words, we heard a faint, tentative slithering underneath us. "It's probably smelled us already," I whispered. "I think it's feeling around for a way to get at us. It may be able to slide through a crack, like water. Come on." That was enough for Bill. Together we started our work all over again, tearing apart the half-finished dory. There was no moon, and the starlight was insufficient to see by. We set up a couple of tapers and labored as best we could in their feeble glow. It was a humid night. In 10 minutes we were soaked with perspiration while we ripped the boards apart and began fastening them into a rude raft. And all the while the thing throbbed in great beats underneath us and made loathly noises that nauseated us. If it had been a definite kind of animal, we might have stood it better. But the beast was amorphous, or rather protean, and the only sounds that it made were its movements and the pulse of its life, except once in long whiles when it emitted an inarticulate and dreadful unvocal cry. I could not help thinking of the beast as a disembodied stomach, expressing its hunger for food, and its audible desire was the more shocking for it implied neither the animal nor the organic, but the sub-vital. The sub-organic, as though the monster, God forgive me for the thought, belonged halfway between dead earth and living bodies. Desperate, anxious, fearing, and apprehensive, we worked in semi-darkness with reckless haste. The ship was ghostly on the dark waters, and the tapers shed a phantom glow. Very close I heard the eerie sounds of the thing below. I do not know how long we strove. An hour, perhaps 2. The grey dawn was coming before our rough raft had been sufficiently completed to be launched. 2 more planks, and she'll be ready, I told Bill. It'll only take me a minute or so to finish. We'll save time if you go over to the stores and bring the food back while I put the planks on. Better hurry. Bill nodded and left. I had barely got one of the planks in place when he returned, staggering under a load of miscellaneous provisions. Good work, I encouraged him. Now roll the keg of water here and we'll be set to leave. I heard his steps move away while I prepared to finish my job, and I heard an ominous crack, a bursting smash that came without warning. I leaped to my feet and whirled around, suspecting treachery. Would God that it had been treachery, anything save the reality that stunned me into a momentary stupor. By the dim light of dawn, I saw the main hatch burst open, and out of it bubbled and flowed with torrential swiftness a mass of sickly green corruption, thick, horrible, noxious, suffocating by reason of its putrid stench, and sinisterly alive, and foully sentient with a purpose whose nature I could guess. A heap of crawling liquescence, formless yet held together and directed somehow by a rudimentary awareness, opaque, and yet with dark filaments like hairs or veins or vines weaving a webwork through it, moving swiftly and strangely, with a rhythmic advance and recession, a bloating expansion and contraction as the pulse that dominated the hellish mass rose and fell. Between it and me stood Bill, rigid with fright. Then he gave a strangled cry and bounded toward me. The scene that followed is burned forever on the unfortunate altar of my thoughts. Even as Bill sprang, the pudgy heap vented a rustling hiss and surged outward with a turbulent rush, and flung after Bill a swath of greenish viscidity. He could not help himself, in mid-air as he was from his leap, and down he came in the green horror. And he kept going down, oh God, he kept going down. He dissolved inch by inch in that gluey puddle, and his furious thrashings could not budge him a step. Fire cannot consume nor acid eat so rapidly as that thing consumed and ate and fed upon him and devoured him alive. When he first landed in it, he uttered a piercing shriek, shrill and terrible. I fired both my pistols at the monster and saw the balls rip into the quivering jelly, but nothing indicated that they had had any effect. Then Bill screamed, a long series of uninterrupted screams, rising and falling, frenzied and tortured and insane, until his voice was raw, and only a hoarse and hideous lowing came from his writhing mouth and convulsively cording throat. I prayed for blackest night, but the dawn grew lighter, and the scene stood out with sickening clearness. I fumbled in haste to reload a pistol. Then, with an arm that trembled, I took careful aim and steadied myself and fired true. The ball buried itself in Bill's heart. He sagged, and what was left of him fell. I hope that I was not wrong when I believed I saw the briefest shine of glad thanks in his eyes before they glazed and went blank. And the stuff welled interminably from the hatch, and the corpse dwindled while I watched. A rosy tint began to suffuse the webwork of the monstrous thing. A certain awful muscular distension and contraction shook it. Its stench grew insufferable. A deep horror racked me with a shudder, then panic, ungovernable terror swept me, and I dashed for the rail. I saw the glistening mass drive after me like a hurricane, and I knew that Bill's frightful fate would be mine before ever I could leap into the cleansing sea. And at that moment, the sun's rim slid above the eastern horizon, and its golden rays slanted to the deck. The monster shriveled as though tormented. A voiceless sibilance poured from it. It heaved and twisted and contracted madly down the hatch, leaving behind the back and part of the head of what 10 minutes ago had been a man. Something in the monster's nature, or its long confinement in darkness, had made sunlight an agony which it could not endure. It is now mid-morning. I gave Bill a hasty sea burial. I have written this narrative, and am about to toss it overboard sealed in a bottle, so that if by chance it reach a passing ship, a watch may be kept out for me, and this derelict, if it be sighted, sunk from a distance or wholly avoided. For the monster still is living below, and its dreadful pulse dins through my thoughts, and its disgusting smell defiles the air with charnel odors. Cheated by sunlight, it will emerge again at nightfall. I do not know what my fate will be. The raft may capsize when I launch it. If it does not, I may escape or perish at sea. If it does, I may drown or make my way back aboard. But here the coming of darkness means certain death, by the thing in the ship or by my own hand, for sooner suicide than the consuming loathsomeness of the monster. May God's grace protect me. There is death whichever course I choose. End of Spawn of the Sea by Donald Wandrei. This is the end of the story. Tell us what you think in the comment section. Please subscribe and ring the notification bell so you'll be the first to know when we release new content. If you want to support us, consider joining our channel membership. You will get instant early access to more than 100 stories before their release. This is the only way to support our channel.